Okay? All right, well, let's look at words and terms. And I've got a lot of stuff here. You can look at your notes. I'm going to fly through quite a bit of it. What do you observe about these words and terms? Well, observing what kind of word and term it is, parts of speech, verbal moods, tenses, prepositions, that sort of thing. You observe how words and terms are functioning together in a context. Context is king. And just as I mentioned before, words like hand or trunk can mean a lot of things unless it's placed in a particular context. Right? But once it's placed in the context, like if I said I put the jack in my trunk, that's probably not talking about a tree. Right? The other words help you to understand in what sense trunk is being used there. And so that's why context is so important. In fact, some linguists argue, I'm not sure it's right, some linguists argue words don't mean anything apart from a context. And, observe the word itself is important. Kinds of terms, what kinds of terms should we look at? There's routine versus non-routine terms. So look at, for example, repeated terms. In the Gospel of John, words that are repeated are believe and light and life. In the Sunday school class where I've been teaching, we've been going through Hosea, and I've been pointing out words that keep coming up again by way of repetition. Think about the limitations of written text. Okay? This is one of the dangerous things about texting. That's why we had to invent these little emojis and different things. Because if I write, I hate you, a text, that can mean one thing just by its words, but if I put a smiley face after it, you know I'm not meaning that in a literal way. Right? So, how do you do that when you just have written text? You see, we have things also called nonverbal communication. You can tell how I feel about things based on the tone of my voice, or what I'm doing with my eyes, or whether I've got my arms folded. Right? All that are nonverbal clues to tell you how you should understand the words I'm saying. And sometimes, they say if you're like this and you say, I'm really open. That's a mixed communication because your arms are saying you're not open and the words are saying that I am. How many of you guys, you ask your wife, how are you? And she says, fine. And if you don't pick up on that, right? But the tone of the tone, maybe the terseness of it, tells you, yeah, not everything's happy. We got to figure out what the problem is. There's something, right? How do you do that in black and white text? In the Bible, for example. That's harder to do. It can be done. You can pick up certain clues based on how things are said. What's repeated? What's in? What's left out? Now, of course, what's left out is harder because it's out. But still, repetition, those kind of things. What's being emphasized? For example, in the Bible, it is rare when you have physical description. In other words, if I ask you, what did Jesus look like? You have a hard time describing him to him because you don't know if he had brown hair or black hair, blue eyes, brown eyes. You don't know because the Bible never describes his physical features. Most characters in the Bible, we don't know what Moses looks like. You do have this one thing. It says he was a beautiful child at his birth. And there's something going on. Don't know what to do with that beautiful stuff. All the way in the Hall of Faith in chapter 11, Hebrews 11, it says he was a beautiful or extraordinary child. Now, in pastoral ministry, everybody's baby is wonderful, right? You don't have the option of distinguishing. But something was special about it because he's described that way. David is described as ruddy and handsome. Saul is described as being taller than everybody else. But most times you don't have any description. So whenever you have description, you ought to pay attention and see if we don't have description normally, why is it here? So these are the kind of clues that you need to pick up on because you don't have tone of voice. You don't have body language. You just have black words on a white page. So we have these words that are repeated in John. Righteousness, used 4 different ways in the book of Romans. Immediately in Mark. In Mark, you have this Greek word called euthus. E-U-T-H-U-S. And if you use something like the New American Standard, you'll see this a lot. It'll say immediately or right away. If you use something like the NIV, English doesn't like when you use words over and over again. So they won't use immediately. They'll change it to something else so that the style flows a bit better. Which makes for easier reading, but then you lose something in your observation because you don't know, unless you know the Greek there, you don't know that word's being used. So in the Gospel of Mark, things are always happening immediately. That's why I say of the 4 Gospels, right, the Gospel of Mark is the action movie version. Mark talks a lot about Jesus' teaching. It just doesn't include as much of the teaching itself. It's about action. It's moving along. It's paced fairly quickly. Immediately he went there. Immediately he does this. That euthus comes up again and again. The idea of better in Hebrews. Jesus is better than the prophets and better than the angels and offers a better covenant, has a better covenant, better than Moses. This idea of better than repeated in Hebrews. In faith in Hebrews 11. Notice you can even go through there and just mark how many times so-and-so, in faith he did this, in faith he did that. That's how you pick up on these things. Rare and unusual terms, we have a fancy label for this. We call it hapax legomena. Hapax legomena meaning appearing only once. Why don't you just say appearing only once? Well, because that's why you pay the high cost of this tuition here, see? You learn these words, and I want to challenge you this week, use hapax legomena somehow in your conversation, and you'll make me proud. But there's some words in the Bible that are only used once. 2 Timothy 3:16. All Scripture's inspired of God or God-breathed, whatever your translation says there, that word inspired or God-breathed is theos neustos, which is only used one time in the whole New Testament. And it's a compound word. Theos means God, and pneuma is the word for spirit or breath or wind. So when we say God breathed, it's literally taking that compound word and putting them together. There are 55 words Paul uses only in Colossians. Colossians is only 4 chapters long. So he uses a lot of these words that are unique to him. So we want to notice main verbs and nouns, especially verbs. Whenever you're learning a language, you really can't make progress till you figure out verbs. You got to find a verb. So when you're studying Greek and Hebrew, task number 1 is to find the verb, because that's where the action's going to be. Now, one of the reasons I think in some ways people say which is easier, I like Hebrew because basic Hebrew, it's a VSO language, verb, subject, object. Usually the first word in the sentence is supposed to be a verb. So you can find it right away. That's normal. When you get into poetry and stuff, the rules don't apply, but oftentimes you have that verb right at the beginning. And by the way, when you don't have a verb, like I'm observing in there, in the Hebrew text, if they're not a verb, I'm thinking, I wonder why. That's unusual. Usually what you're saying is something is fronted. In other words, if something's put in front of what's normal, they're trying to emphasize whatever's put in front. In Hebrew, but especially in Greek, all verbs have the subject in it. You don't have to have a subject. So in English we would say he hit the ball. In Greek, he hit would be in one word. You don't need two words. It's part of that verb. And the form tells you if it's he is the third person, right? He, she, it. I hit would be another form. But if it says I and the verb says I hit, so it's basically, if you're literal, I hit. Now it's emphasizing I hit it. Because you don't need the separate word for I. So when I'm observing, I notice, I say, okay, you don't need that, so why is it here? It's usually emphasizing something. All right. Difficult words, those ones like propitiation and apostasy and revelation. By the way, things like, sometimes these words like apostasy is not a word that's translated. What's the Greek? Apostasia. They've turned the Greek word into English word. Why do they do that? Well, sometimes it's because they don't know what to do with it. Just being true. Sheol. Selah. Those words that are just, you're basically taking the original language and turning it into an English word because you're not exactly sure what it means. And then you depend upon the Bible teacher or preacher or whatever to figure it out and explain it. So difficult words are certainly worthy of intense study. And difficult words may be words that you don't know. I won't put anybody on the spot here with asking you to define propitiation for me. It's not a disease. I know it sounds like one, but it's not. Propitiation basically is when you're dealing with the wrath of God. You propitiate the wrath of God, like you're pouring cold water on this flame of God's wrath. But so if there's words that you don't know, even English words, that's why they make dictionaries. And those are words that you want to consider. The noun family. And again, this you're saying, this is grade school stuff. It is, but that's what you got to do. You got to remember this stuff. Nouns are person, places, things, or ideas, that sort of thing. Person like John. Place like Patmos. I was in Patmos on the Lord's Day, the book of Revelation would say. A thing might be like blood, altar, something like that. Idea, like grace. Peace, contentment. Those things. And we have actions that can be nouns. Actions, you're thinking that's a verb, but crucifixion be a noun. Baptism. So notice the nouns. Pronouns. Pronouns are words that substitute for nouns. So that we don't have to say Charles did this, Charles did this, Charles did this. You could say Charles did it, he did this, and so on. It just makes it easier. And so we have different kinds of pronouns, relative pronouns, who, which, that, what, intensive, himself, herself, reciprocal. All those one another passages in the New Testament, those are reciprocal. Pray for one another. Encourage one another. Those different one another's that we have in the Bible. Adjectives. Adjectives qualify a noun or pronoun. Faithful God, fervent prayer, devout Greek. Right? Those are adjectives. They describe. You ought to pay attention to those adjectives. Prepositions, a word that goes with a noun or pronoun to form a prepositional phrase. For, we looked at that, right? For was a preposition in John 3:16, that very first word. With, by, to, in, against, into, etc. Those are all prepositional phrases. Articles. That's like the word the, right? It particularize or qualify a word. A book is different than the book. Right? You may have a book, but this is the book. There's a difference. And so we need to pay attention to those articles or absence of articles at times. The verb family. Verb or action words, right? Action, or what a noun or pronoun does. Run, walk, says, stoops, etc. Verbs have three elements in English. They have tense, past, present, and future. Right? I was sleeping. I am sleeping. I will sleep tonight, hopefully. Right? So you have different tenses. Voice, active, passive, or middle. I already talked a little bit about that. Active. I hit Andreas. That would not be a nice thing to do, but I suppose I could do that. It would be even worse if Andreas hit Charles. That would be passive. And it would, for some reason, I don't know what I'd be thinking if Charles hit himself. I hit myself. That would be middle or reflexive. Right? So verbs can function these ways. Mood is indicative, is like a statement. It makes a statement. Interrogative asks a question. Imperative is a command. So how does it function? What is the mood? Is it a command? Is it a question? Is it a statement of fact? So all these things you have to pay attention to. And again, it's to some degree, it's just like learning English again. You're just slowing down and you're paying attention to how this works. Adverbs, they modify or qualify a verb. He ran fast. She came early. He forgave freely. It's not always the case, but you notice oftentimes adverbs that have that ly ending. In two of these three cases it does. English is, maddeningly inconsistent, so you can't just say, okay, this is the way it always is. But usually you have that ly that's going to be an adverb. Connectives. These are conjunctions, words that connect other words, but indicates a contrast. Not this, but that. It's not the only way it functions, but it's one of the main ways it functions. I like you, but. I would hire you, but. Okay. Like is going to be some kind of comparison. You are like a beautiful flower, or something like this. Because provides a reason. Because it's raining. Take your umbrella. Because provides a reason for taking an umbrella. Consequently or therefore indicates a result. Therefore, do thus and so based on what's gone on before. When indicates time. I'm going to go talk to the boss about a raise, and when I start talking, you come in just at that moment. Tell them how great I am. Then it offers a conclusion. Right? So we've talked about we need to observe words and terms. But you also need to observe punctuation. In fact, in the John 3:16 exercise, that's what I started with. I think that's one of the best places to start. It's the low-hanging fruit. because you know what a period is. You know what commas are. You know what question marks are. Just get a handle. Okay, what am I dealing with? Is it a sentence? Is it part of a sentence? You know, what is it? And find the punctuation. Start with the easy stuff first, and then you can build up to some of the other stuff. So you win those little victories right at the beginning, you get encouraged. And so punctuation is often the easiest thing you can do, but important. So note especially periods. Periods complete a sentence. Sentences are a complete thought. Commas, semicolons, question marks, parentheses, apostrophes. Apostrophes usually indicate possession. Charles' apostrophes book, that's Charles's book. I own it, it's my book. And quotation marks. Someone is talking. These are their words. But don't forget about the dash and hyphen when you're separating things, exclamation marks and colons, and I think those are the main punctuation marks there. But again, that's an easy thing to do. See, you can do this. Just go home, pick whatever verse you want to look at. Just say, okay, today I'm just going to look at punctuation and jot them down. When I'm working through a passage in order to teach and preach it, I want to know where the complete thought is. So I'm going to look at punctuation. And I often do that sometimes in different translations because translators punctuate differently. The NIV is trying to be readable. English doesn't like long sentences. So it has short sentences, so it's going to have a lot more periods than maybe some other translation might have. In Ephesians 1, verse 3 through verse 14, that's one long sentence in Greek. When I went to school, that would be considered a run-on sentence. My teacher would not have liked that. In Greek, it's perfectly fine. It's fine Greek, it's poor English. So you got to decide, okay, where the periods go. That's what translators do. And sometimes they don't quite agree. They don't always agree on where to put that. I'll just show you something here. I'm going to go off script a little bit. Look at Ephesians 1. Well, you didn't know I had a script, but I'm going off my script. Ephesians 1. And it'll be helpful here if we have these different translations. If you look at verse 4, Ephesians 1 and verse 4, I'm reading out of the ESV. Even as He chose us in Him. Now I would observe here that's starting in the middle of a sentence, by the way. Even as He chose us in Him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before Him, period. Some of your translations are going to have a comma before Him, or not a comma there at all, before Him in love. In love is finishing that thought, not beginning the next one. So, does in love go with verse 4? Or does it introduce verse 5? Well, you'll have translations on both that'll come out both sides of it. Because in Hebrew you got this phrase, and grammatically it can go with either one. So it's an interpretive call. So in love either tells us how we are holy and blameless before Him. We're in love. Or in love tells us how we've been predestined. The next thought. So you have these things. It's just and so if you have different translations out, you notice, I wonder why it does that. How come one has a period and one doesn't? And remember, when you observe something, you know to look at it. If you can't interpret what you don't see. But punctuation is important. Structure or formatting. Structure involves all the relations, interrelations, which bind terms to a literary unit. It's easier to see this. We have grammatical units. We have the term, this word. Words form phrases. Phrases might become clauses if you have a verb in it. Clauses can become sentences, and sentences become paragraphs. And in literary units, a group of paragraphs they call a segment. Subsection is a group of segments. A section is a group of subsections. And a division is a group of sections. And a book is a group of divisions. Now, you don't need to know all that. There's no test on that. Even in seminary, I don't test on that. But just that you're aware of it. You got small units, and they're part of bigger units, which are part of bigger units, which are part of bigger units. And it's helpful to know what unit you're looking at. So at the very top, you have a term or word. It's part of a phrase, which is part of a clause, which is part of a sentence, part of a paragraph, part of a segment, part of a subsection, part of a section, a division, and a book. So you're trying to figure out what it exactly you're dealing with. All right? Structural progressions, we can notice those. They're part of this structure. Emphasis on the who. In Genesis 12 through 50, we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Think about this. 12 through 50, you got, what's that, about 38 chapters or so? I always get confused when I'm adding and subtracting, about 38 chapters. There's 50 in Genesis. We fight all over chapter 1 through 11 because it has creation and all these other things. But the real story is with Abraham. 1 to 11 is intro. How do you know? Because it's 11 chapters compared to 38. You have this long period of time. Scholars can debate on how long it is from the creation of the world to the Tower of Babel. This long, and then it slows down almost to a crawl for one family of what, 3, 4 generations or so? For the bulk of the book. 1 and 2 Samuel, you see the life of David. You see this progression in his life. A historical progression, emphasis on the what. This is what I'm talking about. Genesis 1 to 11, events include creation, fall, flood, and Babel. By the way, right now, you can know Genesis. You got to remember 4 things, chapters 1 to 11. Some of my class ought to be able to do this. We have creation, fall, flood, and Babel. Or nations, whatever you want to call it. Four things. And then 4 people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. You know 8 things, you know Genesis. You don't know it completely, but you know enough. You know the basics. Chronological, emphasis on the when. John 1 and 2, there's 21, and 21 are built around a 7-day cycle. Why is that? Judges has this cycle of disobedience. Israel sins. God sends some kind of judgment on them. They cry out to God. God raises up a judge. The judge delivers them. They enjoy a period of peace and prosperity, and then they go back in their sin again. And it's over and over and over. There's 7 of those cycles in Judges. So you have this chronological. Geographical, emphasis on the where. In Acts, from Jerusalem to Judea and Samaria, the ends of the earth. I believe that's how the book of Acts is outlined. You can look in Acts and say, okay, in this section, the church is in Jerusalem. In this section, now they're branching out into Judea and Samaria. Then with the missionary journeys, they begin going to Philippi and Rome and other places. That geographical progression to the ends of the earth. Logical or ideological, emphasis on the why. The progress of witness in the book of Acts. How the witness expands out. Starts out with Jewish people. Then you got Samaritans, which are, kind of like sort of half Jewish. Then you got Gentiles and so on. So we can see these progressions. Structural relationships, words of connection for these structures, and And this comes from Traina again. He has this teleacrostic. The T stands for temporal connectors. So you notice words like after, as, before, now, then, until, when, and so on. You have emphatic connectors. Indeed, only, always, those kind of things. Logical connectors, where, and local connectors, where's something taking place, and logical connectors. I'll leave that for you to look at. And then we have genre. We've already touched upon genre. Genre is a type of literature. We normally read, and we don't even think about genre. So if we're reading a mystery novel, we kind of expect a mystery. It'd be a strange mystery novel not to have a mystery. Right? So we know when we pick that up, if you're going to pick up an Agatha Christie mystery, there's going to be usually some kind of crime, some kind of mystery in figuring it out. Sherlock Holmes, same thing. We know this because that's the genre. And so genres are really important to recognize. Because what type of literature it is will determine to some degree how you observe it and how you interpret it. What you're looking for. Just like you're not going to look for an Astros score in an obituary. Literary forms related to genre. You need to identify those. Poetry has a particular form. If I just put a poem up here, most of you would be able to, if you read a little bit of it, you'd be able to figure out this is a poem. It doesn't sound like something else. Right? It just has that feel of a poem. Or if I put music lyrics up here, you're thinking this is not prose. These are words to a song. You would be able to figure it out. It doesn't have the feel of something else. How do you know? Well, because in poetry, you usually have things like unusual words, right? If in poetry you're painting with words. So you don't use boring words like cold. That's too boring. You'd use frigid or icically or something. I don't know. So you're going to the thesaurus and finding something because cold is just too hard is another word. You're going to have to come up with something because you're painting with words. And usually poetry are short lines. Right? You don't have... Think about words of a song. How many of them go 2 or 3 lines long? They don't work that way. You don't have enough breath to get to the end of that. Sing that whole line. So if you got short things, got weird word, not weird, but rare or unusual terms, sometimes you have rhyme in there. We have a hymn that we sing. It says, Godhead 3 in 1, Father, Spirit, Son. It's almost always Father, Son, Spirit. Why Father, Spirit, Son? Well, because Son rhymes with 1. Spirit doesn't rhyme with 1. So you've massaged that a little bit so you can get the rhyme. All right. So to observe basic genres, you must know what they are. We have narrative, poetry, law, epistolary. Epistolary is like letter form. Wisdom, right? Proverbs. And we have prophecy. And you have to identify the basic characteristics of each one of those genres. What is it there? Now, I dare say that if I took a passage out of Leviticus, one of the law passages, and just said, what is this? You'd say, yeah, something on mildew or something. You're saying that's part of the law. You'd figure it out. But different ways of communicating are serving different purposes. right? How many of you have an instruction manual to any piece of equipment that's written in poetry? Your owner's manual to car, does it come in poetry? The poetry version? No, because poetry doesn't convey that kind of information well. One of the reasons I didn't like reading poetry, like Emily Dickinson and others, I just told my teacher, I don't want to work that hard. Just tell me what I'm supposed to feel. I don't want to work that hard. But of course, that undermines the purpose of poetry. But I just want the facts, right? Just tell me what I'm supposed to feel, and that poetry doesn't work that way. Literary forms related content and function. When we talk about function, we're talking about something called poetics. Now, poetics is a word you're thinking this has something to do with poetry. It really doesn't. Poetics is the grammar of literature. We know how we have a grammar of language. We've been talking about nouns, verbs, that sort of thing. Punctuation, that's grammar. But how does language work? That's poetics. So you could put it this way. It's not what does this passage mean, but how does this passage mean? That's poetics. That's getting in a little bit of the deep water here. By the way, Lord willing, if this all works out well, we'll have a part 2, a more advanced presentation. We're thinking already about this, and so we'll see how things go. And tone, again, I talked about tone already. This is the more difficult thing. Tone is the author's attitude or emotion expressed through the text. And this is sometimes hard to pick up on because you just have black letters. You don't have a smiley face or something next to the sentence. You don't have bold or italics. I mean, you do, but it's for other purposes. So this is hard to pick up on, but it's something that we should try to find. For example, Jesus is before Pilate in the Gospel of John, and they get in this discussion, and Jesus reminds him that he's truth. And Pilate says, what is truth? Now, is he making a philosophical statement? Is he saying, almost dismissively, yeah, what is truth? Yeah, is it sarcastic? Is it, what is truth? We don't know because it doesn't say as Pilate said with a smirk on his face. We don't have any kind of descriptor what his face looked like or the tone of his voice when he said it. But think about this, and they have a version out there. The Gospel of John has been created into a video where all the words in it come from the Gospel of John. The actor's going to ask the director, how should I say that line? You're going to have to make some judgment call on it. Because he's going to have to use his voice. He's going to have to use his face and his body and that. And you'll have to make some call on it. That would be like tone. What's the tone? Mood is really the impact that text has on the reader. What does this make you feel once it hits you? Does it encourage you? Does it rebuke you? Does it challenge you? All right. So some concluding thoughts on observation, and we're getting close to the finish line here. All right. 1, observe carefully, but record your observations freely. So just write stuff down. Paper's inexpensive. If you're doing it on computer, it's even easier. Some of you come out of like the business world and all that. Sometimes you have these brainstorming sessions, at least the ones that I was in. Brainstorming sessions, the boss will say, hey, we got this issue. I want you to suggest any solutions out there. It can be as wild as you want. We'll filter them out later. We're just going to write everything down, get these ideas and throw them on the wall, and we'll sort it out later. That's kind of what you're doing. You're brainstorming. Your observations are brainstorming. You may find out that you observed something, and later on, it's really not altogether helpful. It's an observation. It's legitimate. Let's say, in John 3:16, for God is the subject. Now that is true. That's an observation, but what are you going to do with that? How does that help you? You may not find it helps you a lot. It's important to know what the subject of the clause is. But that's probably where its value begins and ends, maybe. Other things that you observe will be really important. Okay, but you sort that out later on in the next step of interpretation. But you cannot interpret what you don't observe. So put it down. Not every observation will ultimately prove to be significant. This comes from that point, the previous point. So, your observation shouldn't treat them like your children. You feel bad if you toss it out. It's not anything. You're not going to toss your kids out, but you can toss your observation out. It may not just be all that helpful at the end of the day. But it's a good exercise to have noted it. And 3, exercise caution. Exercise caution when your observations seem to be one that no one else has seen before. It's possible you've discovered something new, but it's unlikely. People have been reading the New Testament for about 2,000 years, and you may be the first one to ever seen this before, and it's I can't rule it out, but probably not. All right. Well, that takes me through the things I wanted to talk about today as far as your handout. I believe that takes us to the end with the concluding remarks here. Let me open it up now for comments or questions, disagreements, debates. You can make me mad. Like I said, I'm stuck to this thing. I probably can't come get you. So we're okay. Thoughts, questions you might have had. We have about 10 minutes or so to finish on time. So we have the time. Yes, sir.
You made an observation on John 3:16.
Yes, sir.
I have the New Language Translation, and it has the
manner.
Mark, but I can't figure out where it ends. Where does it end?
Well, okay. In English convention, whenever you have a paragraph, you can start with a quotation mark, but you don't end it until it finally ends. So the very last paragraph will have the concluding mark.
Okay.
That's just normal English convention.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
When you have no punctuations, I guess as in Hebrew, how do you know what is the thought and where it ends? Do you go to another sort? Obviously, you're not going to go to the English version, but how do you know how to break it up into thoughts and when it's complete?
Oh, okay. Well, the Greek and Hebrew Bibles that we use, like let's say seminary students get, they are punctuated. They've done the work already.
Oh, okay.
Now, sometimes again they'll disagree or they'll question and they might have a footnote there saying we're not exactly sure, but we think we should, punctuate it here. So you normally don't have to do that.
Okay, so basically it's like one of the English translations.
Yeah, since it's been worked on, they have punctuated it. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I know you were talking about how in English and black letters it's hard to tell tone or mood. So do Hebrews and Greek, are they better when you're studying those? Does it do a better job of doing that?
Not really. They're still black words on a white page. They're just in another language.
Yeah.
So you still have that. You think about certain word choices, though. In Philippians 3, Paul is talking about his Jewish heritage. And he says, I count it but dung. Okay? When you look at that word translated dung in Greek, it can be it can be a little graphic. Some have said, I'm not sure it's right, they would say in our terms it might be the SH word, which tells you, he said pretty strongly, all that my Jewish heritage in comparison to Christ don't mean squat. That's the PG version. Right? So the choice of word might indicate tone. Because he could have used a softer word. In fact, that's what we often do sometimes. If the Song of Solomon, and there's debate on how you should understand that, if the Song of Solomon does relate to marriage, love, and sexuality, the references to sexuality are not graphic for the most part. They're what we call euphemisms, right? Polite ways of talking about something without saying it. We use euphemisms, by the way, when we say Uncle Joe passed away. We don't say Uncle Joe died. We do, but we'll say passed away. They went to be with the Lord. You know, they're no longer amongst us. Those are ways, the softer ways of talking about something that is usually something we don't want to talk about. So if they use a very straightforward word where you expect a softer word, then it might indicate that they're feeling towards it. Maybe trying to shock a little bit, in fact. In the Old Testament prophets, and Jesus does this as well, when he says, "Woe to you, Pharisees and scribes." Woe in the prophets is a funeral word. When you say woe, basically you're saying you're dead meat. This is what you say at people's funeral. And now you're saying you're good as dead. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. And so it's a pretty strong, you woe somebody, that's a, it's pretty strong. Yes, sir.
So Charles, you're studying the Scripture and you come upon a text that's confusing to you, so you're trying to figure out what it says, so you go to several translations of that Scripture, and you get some completely different meanings when you do that. Now, does that mean that the three different translations, those people have gone through this process and they just have reached a different conclusion? Is that basically what we're talking about?
Yeah, and the other thing is, I think that in a strange way you ought to be encouraged, because that passage has confused some really smart folk, because they have these differences of opinion. If it was obvious, they'd all agree. But you're talking about people who've made a lifetime studying these things and they can't agree on it, so little wonder that you have problems. And so you do the best you can. This side on this fallen earth, you do the best you can. Usually, when you reach an impasse, what you do is you turn to a commentary and try to see what the smartest people in the room that you can find say about it. What I'm discouraging, though, in Bible study methods is that you start with a commentary. Don't start there. Do your work first, and then, as a last resort or a later resort, you turn to a commentary. Because think about this, and it's happened to me a number of times. I figured something else on my own. Then I turned to commentaries to make sure I got it right, and I found it. They're saying exactly what I was saying, but I didn't learn it from them. I'd learned it. So I feel good. I said, man, I came up with that. And this smart guy, with all these letters behind his name, he said the same thing.
He copied you.
Well, I know he copied me, but you can be encouraged that you and these, this learned commentator are tracking the same way. But if you turn there, then you don't have that joy of discovery. You rob yourself of that opportunity. What else?
It's
Yes, sir.
interesting as we listen to this and go through this. We think of the original author,
Are you talking about the divine author or the human author?
the divine author.
Yes, sir.
The divine author that put this all down. I mean, here he's put all this down through individuals.
Right.
And yet, and here we are trying to figure it out. It just makes it even more incredible. My ways are not your ways.
Yeah.
I just, it's kind of mind-boggling in a way.
You do indeed. Human language, I mean, languages of any kind, English, German, French, Greek, Hebrew, all limited. You know, that's why they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? Because there's limitations anytime you use written text. But God chose to reveal Himself through written text. And so it has great benefit, but it also has limitations. And so we're thankful for it. And I think that in a strange way for me, the fact that it is difficult keeps us trusting in Him and realizing our own finiteness and limitations to our own understanding. Is, you know, even if you get a PhD, you could still not figure everything out. You know what I'm saying? So God's Word has a way of making you humble, keeping you humble. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Throughout the Bible, there's a lot of, it's all written down and everything, but then there's italics stuff, which is, I always thought would be, it wasn't part of the original, but they've added it to make it clearer or something. Is that the way it is?
That's one way of formatting that some translations will do is put in italics those words that are brought in to maintain sense. Now, some people get a little bit nervous about that. In most cases, it's fine. In Hebrew, it's quite often that they'll have nouns and no verbs. The verb's implied. And so you have to, it wouldn't make any sense in English. But in Hebrew, it's perfectly fine Hebrew not to include a verb in certain places, and just assume usually some kind of verb of I am or something like that. A verb is, something like that that's implied. And so if they're going to put it, it's not in the Hebrew, they're going to put is there. That is going to be italicized because technically it doesn't come from the Hebrew text, even though it really ought to be there.
What if there's like a whole sentence that has quotation marks and everything?
It's all italicized?
Yeah.
Well, it depends on your translation. That may mean that it's quoted or something. It's an Old Testament text or something, or one of the things when you look at your Bible, you get a new Bible, look at the front part. It explains how it's formatted, and so not everyone agrees on the proper formatting. An example, by the way, is that the word Lord. In many English conventions, if it's all caps, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, that's the divine name, Yahweh. That's separate from the word capital L, lowercase o, R, D. That's a different word. That's a title. Adonai. And so, how do you know? Because Lord is Lord, and if you don't know Hebrew, that's the way some English translations are saying, okay, when it's all caps, that means the divine name is being used. When it's not, it's when this word is being used. And so there's just different ways that they chose to communicate something that might be confusing. So, yes?
Is when you get into the doing a word translation where you go to either the Greek or the Hebrew in your word translation books, is there a danger of going to the root? But Greek and Hebrew is so much more deeper and beautiful. But is there a danger of when as you go back and then go back to the root of kind of getting off the track of what's really happening there since you don't really know the language?
Well, it's true in anything, even in English. I plan to talk about when we get to interpretation. But for example, most of us, when we use words, we don't know that it come from the old Latin or the French and what it might used to mean. We're using what that word means to us today. You know, did any fans of NCIS here? You remember Ducky? He'll hear a word and then he'll tell you, this comes from the old Latin, this word, and he traces all that. It's kind of cool because no one knows that stuff except Ducky. And yet they're using this word. So when we use a word, we normally don't have in our mind, okay, this is old Latin, that's why I'm using it. And so to bring that in and say that's what the author meant, bringing all that stuff in, it's probably not going to be the case. It's cool as far as it goes. Here's another thing. Let's say, and words change over time. Let's take the word gay. You go back to Charles Dickens, and they had a gay old time or something like that. It means something else than you might say people having a gay old time today. And it'd be wrong to import Charles Dickens' understanding into saying, well, everyone in the same sex are happy, because that's what the term gay means. Now, that's what it means now. And it'd be equally wrong to take the homosexual meaning and say, yeah, Charles Dickens, he was for LGBTQ because he's using this word.
But when you translate the Greek, when you do a word study,
Yep.
and you take a Greek Bible and you pull a word out of it, it's going to be pretty close.
No, I mean, it might be, but the Greek language, like any language, it's living. The New Testament Greek's a dead language. No one speaks it today.
So we don't know if you can speak Greek, and if you're going to translate the Greek into English, you don't really know if that's really what it means.
Well, you have an idea, and context helps. But, even classical Greek is different than what we call Koine Greek, the period of New Testament Greek.
Well, would you advise not to do word study in that respect?
No, I think you do the word study. It's what you do with the word study that matters. It's always nice to know, and it may be helpful, but it may be over-interpreting something by bringing all of it in. They call it illegitimate totality transfer. We got in theology, we got to have these big labels. Illegitimate totality transfer. When you're dumping the whole bucket of everything and say, this is what it means. Yeah. Good question, though. We'll talk more about that later, and that's really maybe even more of an advanced class where we get into some of that stuff. But I think I planned to introduce it. If I remember right, when I was going through my notes, I was going to talk about that. But the nuancing of that, how do you do word studies and stuff, is probably a more advanced class. I'd like to stop on time, and we're actually a few minutes over, so let me pray, and we'll just consider ourselves dismissed. I'll hang around for a few minutes if you have questions, and if I can help you in any way, let me know that. And remember that we are not meeting next week. Okay, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you that you have given us this book that we call the Bible. Thank you that it is a sufficient and wonderful way of knowing the truth and knowing what it is that you expect of us. And we're grateful for that. And we understand that sometimes studying it is not so easy. And so thank you that there have been men and women throughout the ages that have developed ideas and methods that would help us to better understand the Scriptures, and hopefully in these weeks today and the weeks ahead, we will be able to get comfortable with a method that would help us to maximize our time in your Word. Thank you for each one that's come out this evening. I pray that you would bless them as they seek to study your Word and to grow closer to you. I ask that you grant them traveling mercies to their homes, and that they would glorify you in whatever they say and do. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.